deployment, I will be creating something called as a replica set, right? So when a replica set is created, that replica set is going to actually create my pods. Okay. In Kubernetes, you will create a deployment. The deployment will create a replica set that will ensure this many pods are running for this particular service. And then that replica set will bring up the pod. Okay. So when a container is running on Kubernetes, by default, it will not be available for the other pods to connect, or something like even from the external world, you will not be able to by default consume these services. Okay. So in Kubernetes, I need to expose them as a service. Okay. There are two ways you can expose a service. One is called as an internal service, and another one is called as an external service. Okay. Internal service means like within the cluster, within the Kubernetes cluster, I will be able to communicate to the service. Okay, that is called as an internal service. A typical example will be your database. Your database you will never expose to the external world. It will be always accessible by my business logic layer. So I will be exposing this as an internal service. Okay, this is one way of exposing a service. And another way is exposing this as an external service, where external network connection will be given to that. There are multiple methods. There are multiple methods to expose a service. We'll talk about that in detail when we go to our networking concept. Okay, we'll talk about that. So the concept of mapping an IP address or a DNS name to a deployment is called as the service. Okay, but when I'm doing a service mapping, I have to select for which deployment I need to providing this service, right? So that is where the labels comes into picture. Labels are very, very important concept in Kubernetes. Like labels are equivalent to your tags in the server scenario. Like for example, imagine if you guys have worked on your AWS infrastructure or any on-prem scenario, when you want to find out to which application this server belongs to, we'll be creating something called as a tags. In the tags, you'll be defining that, okay, this server belongs to dev environment. And in the dev environment, this belongs to this application. And in this application, this is a web server or app server or a DB server. Like that, we'll be naming the server. So it is something similar to that. Whenever you do a deployment, you can specify that this deployment is for this environment, this application, and inside the application, this is the service, and inside the service, this is the component. Okay, those kind of multiple labels you can define, which can be used to map the services with the deployment. Not only mapping, for other activities also you can use. Like for example, you are going to create a dashboard saying all the pods, I want to list, show the CPU usage of all the containers which are connected to this particular microservice. So there you will use the labels to filter them. Okay, so labels are very effectively used in Kubernetes. So whenever you are designing your application, always design them with proper labeling thing, and try to give as much as label possible to find the uniqueness of the application. Okay, so these are all the advantages of the labels. And next concept in Kubernetes is called namespace. So namespace are kind of a logical segregation of your cluster. Like for example, in your organization, you are using one cluster. Inside that, there are multiple applications are hosted in the cluster. Let's say I have my finance application hosted there, HR application hosted there. So I should logically segregate them, right? The finance application should not have direct connection to my HR application, or the resource who are managing the finance application should not have access to the HR application. So those kind of things I can achieve it using namespace. Okay, and also it helps you to restrict the pod-to-pod communication. Like by default, any pods within the namespace can communicate with each other. But if you If the pod is running on one namespace and another pod is running on another namespace, you will not be able to communicate to them. So it's kind of a logical segregation of your cluster. So use that effectively. So it depends to organization to organization. So I have seen people using, for every application, they have a separate namespace, and I have seen applications where they are creating individual namespaces for the customer. Imagine it's a common application which will be used by 10 customers. For every customer, they will have a separate namespace. Okay, so these kind of things are very important, and that is being achieved by using namespace. And we have talked about Kubernetes service, and we have talked about pods, and we have talked about replication controller and replica sets. So these are all the components of the terminologies are majorly used in Kubernetes. We will talk about that in detail when we go into our lab section.